The Cold War was known for its frozen relationship between the East and West, but Camp Century took this to another level, based in the not so warm Greenland. However, the camp was a ruse for something a little more scary, and if it was discovered at the time, it could have made the Cold War a whole lot hotter. Camp Century ran between 1960 and 1966 on the Greenland ice sheet and was based around 150 miles from the then established Fuel Air Base. The camp was intended to test the feasibility of running a military base in Arctic conditions, as well as being used to carry out varying scientific experiments. Interestingly, the base was powered by the world's first portable nuclear reactor. Camp Century uniquely consisted of several trenches dug into the ice and covered by prefabricated arched roofs, which needless to say wasn't a standard thing to do. It might sound like I'm kind of rushing through the description of Century, but the camp itself isn't the most interesting part of the story. It actually was a big cover-up for a secret nuclear weapons silo named Project Iceworm. And due to the time period, you might be able to consider it as the USA's own version of the Soviet Union arming Cuba with nuclear weapons. And we all know how well that went. Now, this sneaky project was intended to have nuclear weapons on the base, with tunnels under the ice covering a whopping 4,000 kilometres, which is the reason for the odd trenches under the ice. Unsurprisingly, this didn't happen, but we will explain the reasons why later. At a depth of 8 metres, the base's tunnels only ended up covering a distance of 3 kilometres. Even still, the excavations boasted a hospital, a shop, a theatre and even a church, all of which were at the use of the 200-man strong team based at the camp. Water was supplied by means of melting ice, which was quite obviously in abundance in the area. However, the water had to be tested for such lovely things as plagues and deadly bacteria. It wasn't all clandestine James Bond villain-esque secrecy though, as the project was hidden in plain sight by publicising Camp Century, even inviting the press to visit the base and its groundbreaking nuclear reactor. Cheekily, the US didn't actually tell the Danish government about what Camp Century was actually there for. And to be honest, there was little reason to question the USA's intentions, as the scientists based there did indeed drill for ice core samples. Without the actual nuclear weapons there, it would have been hard to see what the excavation works would eventually be used for. Interestingly, the first ice cores to study climate change came from the project. As the early 1960s progressed, the USA planned to evolve the project to have around 600 nuclear missiles aimed at the USSR hidden beneath the ice. The report set out in 1960, called Strategic Value of the Greenland Ice Cap, set out a plan to fully implement a launch site covering 130,000 kilometres squared, with new tunnels and missile silos being dug out every year. The missiles planned to be used on the site were a modified version of the Minuteman ICBM, and would be nicknamed, rather aptly, the Iceman.
The Iceman cometh!
Even though the plans were ambitious, the project would be abandoned fully in 1966, and it was Mother Nature's way of letting us know that she didn't like the way we've been treating the planet. In the short 6-year lifespan, the engineers tasked with digging the project discovered that the glacier was actually in a constant state of movement, and all the hard work would be lost within 2 years, which kinda sucks. It's hard to see if you look at a picture of Greenland's ice that it has elastic properties. In 1962, the roof of the reactor room had partially collapsed, and because of this, the reactor was switched off in July 1963, never to be switched back on again. A diesel replacement was used, as the camp could only be operated during the summer between 64 and 66, when it was deemed unfeasible to continue with the excavation works, as they would essentially be taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back. Even though the concept was proven not to work, Camp Century and the Project Iceworm still have a legacy to this day. When the camp was abandoned, much of its nuclear and biological waste were left behind, in the thinking that the snowfall would keep it in an icy protected condition. As well, in the 1960s, they didn't think that global warming was really a thing. If the rate of ice sheet melting continues, we will begin to see the full extent of the waste left behind within 100 years, which is a bit worrying for the local ecosystem. The legacy of the base isn't all doom and gloom, however, as the discovery of the melting ice and the movement of the ice sheet was a direct result of the scientific observations made during the camp's lifespan. Now, Camp Century was an ambitious project, and the scale of the proposed project is something that only could have been approved during a time like the Cold War. It's impressive to think that a base 3 times the size of Denmark could have housed the end of the world.
This team of scientists and engineers are camped above an abandoned Cold War military base that's buried 30 meters below Greenland's ice sheet.
That is Delta storm condition.
They're part of a special climate monitoring program because the underground base that they're studying could eventually thaw out and unearth thousands of tons of toxic waste.
On the top of the world, below the surface of a giant ice cap, a city is buried. This is the story of Camp Century.
During the early years of the Cold War, the U.S. started paying close attention to Greenland. To protect the island from creeping Soviet influence, the U.S. and Denmark signed the 1951 Defense of Greenland Act.
Today, on the island of Greenland, the United States Army has established an unprecedented nuclear-powered Arctic Research Center.
Army personnel put the latest advances in polar construction to the test, building several military bases out on the ice sheet. One of them was Camp Century.
We finally picked this plateau, a smooth white plain of ice for as far as you could see. This was the closest location to Thule, our supply base, which would not be affected by the summer thaw.
The researchers were doing a lot of very fundamental glacier and climate research. Camp Century is probably best known for being home of the first deep ice core to the bed of the Greenland ice sheet. It's like nothing we have today. It was just this phenomenal marriage of technology and innovation in the 1960s.
They built an entire underground city, complete with housing, kitchens, lounges, scientific labs, a chapel, and even a barber shop.
And the whole camp, which could house up to 200 people on a year-round basis, was powered by a nuclear power plant.
The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission invested a ton of R&D into small, portable nuclear power reactors that could be built in remote locations, and Camp Century was the perfect proving ground. The U.S. flew over 400 tons of equipment to Greenland to build a PM2A reactor, and they carefully transported the materials to the base, where scientists then installed it to power the polar camp.
Now here it is, with all 5 control rods withdrawn 6.24 inches, PM2A when critical at 0652 hours.
Camp Century was presented to the world as a heroic conquest of the Arctic in man's never-ending pursuit for knowledge and scientific progress.
They had Walter Cronkite up there doing NewsHour specials back in the 60s. Everybody knew about it. It was no secret.
But this scientific endeavor was actually part of a covert U.S. Army operation, codenamed Project Iceworm. In response to escalating Cold War tensions, the U.S. wanted to position 600 medium-range missiles with nuclear warheads underneath the Greenland ice sheet. All was going according to plan until engineers noticed the ice that surrounded the base was shifting faster than initially projected.
The people who were working at Camp Century did not have an understanding of climate change. They didn't have satellite records, global climate models, these sorts of big data sets that let you see an overview of what's happening to Earth's climate.
The moving ice sheet started to destabilize the underground tunnels, prompting the U.S. Army to abort Project Iceworm.
When Camp Century was decommissioned, only the nuclear reactor was taken out for destructive testing, and the rest of the camp was left in place. And they closed the doors and left. It was abandoned on the assumption that climate wouldn't change, and it would continue to snow at Camp Century forever. And the perpetual snowfall would entomb all of the base infrastructure and eventually bury it.
But the climate has changed. Temperatures have reached record highs in the Arctic, and Greenland's ice sheet is melting at an unprecedented rate, which could turn Camp Century's abandoned waste into a major environmental risk. So, a team of scientists, including William, went back to the site.
In 2017, the government of Denmark, at the request of the government of Greenland, started the Camp Century Climate Monitoring Program. We set up a bunch of instruments that are erected on the ice sheet surface, and then we drill in and we put probes into the ice sheet, It keeps a real-time data stream coming from the Camp Century site, where we monitor a bunch of things, mainly the temperature of the snow, the temperature of the ice, the air temperature, properties that'll help us sort of model how the snow and ice at Camp Century is going to behave over the next century.
They also mapped the debris left behind using ice-penetrating radar.
The radar is perhaps the most time-consuming. You have to manually tow it at a slow speed. It sends out a pulse of energy that goes down into the ice, and then it reflects off different things. It comes back to a receiver. It was 80 kilometers in total. That was a lot of radar.
They turned those radar profiles into a 3D map of the entire debris field.
At Camp Century, you get those horizontal lines of annual accumulation layers, but then you also get these big pockets of chaos. You can see the main tunnels. You can see pieces of debris down to about the size of a vehicle, maybe even a fuel drum. Our preliminary estimate is that we think the debris field is about 55 hectares in size, which is about 100 football fields, and we think it contains just over 9,000 metric tons of debris. We're very interested in how deep everything is and where it is, so that when we go to do our simulations of how much meltwater there might be at the site over the next century, and how deep it is going to percolate into the ice sheet. There's concern that if meltwater starts interacting with the debris field, it could mobilize some contaminants.
Those contaminants include diesel fuel, nuclear waste like radioactive coolant water, and other toxic chemicals from the camp's buildings and general infrastructure. And all of that is on track to seep into the environment.
In the 1960s, the building codes were a little different. So we know, for example, that the materials they were using at Camp Century were rich in PCBs and other types of persistent contaminants. They still come out of the ground kicking. I mean, they don't deteriorate at all. We're sort of at a fork in the road for Camp Century. Under the business as usual climate, it looks likely that we will start to see more melt than snowfall at Camp Century by the end of the century. But if we stick with something like Paris Agreement, we can keep more snowfall than melt beyond the end of the century.
This raises questions about who is ultimately responsible for the cleanup, and that leads us into a geopolitical gray area. Camp Century was a U.S. base on Greenland soil, which was governed by Denmark. Currently, no party has taken responsibility for the abandoned base, and international environmental law really hasn't figured something like this out yet.
It's really a microcosm of the multi-generational, even multinational implications of climate change facing us now. And we have to be very aware of future projections and take action today to go on the high mitigation and low emissions route.
Our planet has a huge ice kingdom that supplies the ocean with 10 to 15,000 icebergs a year. But this is not Antarctica. It's here that the iceberg that sank the Titanic once broke off. 81% of an area the size of Mexico is covered with ice, which is occasionally over 3 kilometers thick. Nearly 2.5 million cubic kilometers of ice and snow. White Land would be a fitting name for this place, but its real name is the most paradoxical that one could think of: Greenland. Nobody knows exactly why that is. Perhaps we'll find the answer under the Greenland ice. It keeps secrets that can surprise and even scare you. What hides under the Greenland ice? Greenland doesn't hide one of its secrets under the ice, but keeps it almost in plain sight. And for a long time, it gave researchers something to think about. This is a mysterious, crater-like geological structure near the city of Monotsok. The formation's dimensions are more than impressive, about 100 kilometers in diameter. Naturally, the impact crater hypothesis arose, and it was even officially proposed in 2012. Scientists have suggested that 3 billion years ago, our planet collided with an asteroid or a comet in this place. Over time, the crater was partially destroyed by erosion and buried almost 23 kilometers underground. If the hypothesis were confirmed, it would be the oldest known impact crater on Earth. However, hopes for a surprising discovery were destroyed when Canadian geologists tested Monotsoke's igneous rocks. They turned out to be identical to those found outside the supposed affected area. This means that they formed as a result of the same geological processes associated with a mysterious magnetic anomaly. The views on this anomaly were outlined in a study published in Earth and Planetary Science Letters. The strange structure appeared not because of a cosmic collision, but due to a mysterious ancient geological process whose nature is yet unknown. So at 2.23 billion years old, the Yarra Bubba crater in Western Australia still retains the title of the oldest known impact crater on the planet. However, the scientific community wasn't disappointed for long. A few years later, Greenland brought yet another impressive surprise. Under the island's ice cap, there was discovered a forest. Of course, to be precise, there were only its signs, but it was still very impressive. And the history of discovery goes far back, almost to the middle 20th century. The U.S. Arctic Military Research Base operated in Greenland from 1959 to 1967. In 1966, scientists conducted a very complex and ambitious experiment, considering the technical capabilities of that time. They drilled a glacier to a depth of 1,368 meters, reached the subglacial soil, and extracted a 14-meter-long core. The last 3.44 meters was the soil, resting under the ice for an unknown amount of time. The research base pursued mostly military purposes, so it didn't study the soil closely. The frozen core was literally left on the shelf and forgotten for many decades. And this turned out to be for the best, since modern analytical methods weren't around in the mid-20th century, and the unique sample would most likely have been wasted. But in 2017, someone remembered what happened in the past. The sample was removed from storage and was carefully examined over the next several years. Fortunately, the researchers' arsenal now had such miracles of science as electron microscopy, energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, cosmogenic nuclides, and all sorts of other state-of-the-art methods. So, when studying the samples mined in Greenland 1.5 kilometers under the ice, the stunned scientists found branches and leaves instead of sand and stone. As it turned out, the largest island on Earth didn't have an ice sheet until relatively recently and was covered with green forest. The study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Ice sheets typically pulverize and destroy everything in their path, says Andrew Christ, one of the study's authors. But what we discovered was delicate plant structures, perfectly preserved. They're fossils, but they look like they died yesterday. It's a time capsule of what used to live on Greenland, he explained. The unexpected find is important not only for understanding the Earth's past. According to the most optimistic estimates, Greenland's glaciers, which are melting at a record pace due to global warming, contain enough water to raise global sea levels by over a meter. Understanding how this ice has disappeared in the past will help to better predict climate change that will occur in the next 50 years. And now, let's see another amazing discovery that shook the scientific world in the past 2021. It would seem that there's nothing supernatural in glacial reservoirs. subglacial lakes have been discovered before, both in Greenland and Antarctica. But one of these findings became almost a sensation. Most of these previously discovered lakes contain only water trapped in ice or between rock and ice, and the origin of these reservoirs comes from the melting water from the glacier itself. However, the recently discovered Paleo Lake most likely formed when there was no ice around it. And this means that we are dealing with a real time capsule that has preserved in itself everything that was here when Greenland was truly green land. The most valuable and fascinating thing that scientists discovered is the bottom sediments of a huge ancient lake hidden by the 1.8-kilometer Greenland ice sheet. This was the first time such a subglacial formation anywhere in the world was found. The study was published by the Earth Institute at Columbia University. The lake bed can be hundreds of thousands or millions of years old and contain unique fossil and chemical traces of past climate and life. Researchers have recreated a detailed picture of the lake basin and its surroundings. They analyzed radar, gravimetric, and magnetic data that was previously collected using aircraft flying at low altitudes over the ice sheet as part of NASA's Ice Bridge operation. Ice-penetrating radar provided a complete topographical map of the land surface beneath the ice. This revealed the outlines of a smooth, low basin lying among the rocks. Measurements have shown that the basin's material is less dense than the surrounding hard rock, a clear indication of perennial deposits, including those of biological origin. All the data suggested that there was a huge lake with an area of about 7,100 square kilometers in this place. To put this into perspective, it's significantly larger than the state of Delaware. The researchers calculated that the lake was between 50 and 250 meters deep. The sediments at the bottom have a breathtaking thickness of 1.2 kilometers. It remains a mystery what these deposits might contain. However, the discovered lake bed may provide an intact, pristine archive of fossils and chemical markers dating back to an unknown distant past. This could be an important repository of information in a landscape that right now is totally concealed and inaccessible, said Guy Paxman, a researcher at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and the leading author of the report. We're working to try and understand how the Greenland ice sheet has behaved in the past. It's important if we want to understand how it will behave in future decades. And since we are talking about the future decades, other researchers have some bad news for us. The fact that the Greenland ice sheet is melting has been known for a long time, but only now an international research team has discovered that it could completely disappear by as early as the middle of this century. The lakes forming on the glacier's surface are at fault. They are rapidly expanding and merging into larger reservoirs due to global warming. Water seeps into the shield's base and stimulates destruction from within by transferring heat. Because of this, there appear cracks that accelerate other lakes running off. According to the researchers, such a chain reaction can accelerate ice melting by 400%. One of the research group members, Paul Christofferson of the University of Cambridge, confirmed this ice sheet was relatively stable 25 years ago, but now it loses 1 billion tons of ice every day. This causes 1 millimeter of global sea level rise per year, a rate which is much faster than what was predicted only a few years ago. Ecologists say that the glacier's core would never have been directly exposed to heat if it were not for the newly forming lakes. They used to take weeks or even months to appear, but now they appear in a matter of hours. To make a more detailed forecast, scientists have created a 3D model based on observational data obtained in recent years. One of the proposed scenarios showed that up to 124 lakes can flow out in 5 days, with their networks reaching up to 135 kilometers long. This data suggests that the entire Greenland ice sheet could melt completely by the middle of the 21st century. Christofferson added, transfer of water and heat from the surface to the bed can escalate extremely rapidly due to a chain reaction. In one case, we found all but one of 59 observed lakes drained in a single cascading event. Just think about it. We may well see a time when Greenland will turn into something completely different. For example, something like this. It's not difficult to guess what will happen to the global sea level. The melting of Greenland alone would raise levels up to several meters. The estimates vary greatly, but none of them bode well. It would seem that we should raise the alarm. In fact, environmentalists have been literally screaming about the impending disaster for more than a year now. But considering these terrible forecasts, many analysts notice that Greenland's authorities are strangely passive, and this tacit agreement finds a rather transparent, albeit extremely cynical, explanation. Melting glaciers promise to make Greenland crazy rich. This is the village-like town of Narsaq in the south of Greenland, with a population of about 1,200 people. According to preliminary estimates, the nearby area contains up to a quarter of the world's reserves of rare metals. Nowadays, such elements as terbium, cerium, lanthanum, and praseodymium are priceless treasures. And gold doesn't even come close to how valuable they are. These metals are crucial for high technology. They are used everywhere, from smartphones to nuclear reactors. And there are plenty of places like Narsaq on the island, and even more places that are, for the most part, still deserted. Greenland has almost 40 million tons of rare metals waiting for their time to shine. For comparison, world reserves excluding Greenland are 120 million tons. One doesn't need to calculate Denmark's potential income on a calculator. It's simply mind-blowing. Researchers continue to discover more and more previously unknown natural resource deposits in Greenland. Iron, zinc, vanadium, chrome ores, nickel, platinoids, and diamonds. All these resources haunt entire countries, not to mention profit-seeking magnates. Until now, Greenland's ice sheet has multiplied by 0 any serious industrial exploitation of the island's natural resource. But global warming is bringing a new gold rush closer than ever.